Welcome to Above the Canopy, your pulse on supply chain and logistics. Here we surface the research, the voices, and the perspectives that matter most.
All right, welcome everybody to Above the Canopy, Redwood's podcast on thought leadership within supply chain, where we talk to some really exciting and innovative thought leaders and get their insight on what's happening in our industry. So today we're lucky to have Bryant Smith, the Director of Product Management at Manhattan. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Eric. Looking forward to today's conversation and talking about some topics that are front and center for some of our customers.
Right. Yeah. Nothing volatile in our industry or changing ever. So let's
Never.
let's just jump right into it. So let's just go right there, right? Volatility, the acceleration of technology, continued margin pressure, right? Everything that we see every day within our industry, right? And I think you could argue that every year, this accelerates. But maybe just compare this moment that we're in to where we were even a few years ago, even a little bit past COVID. And maybe talk about what you're seeing now versus, just a couple of years back.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you kind of nailed it on the head is that change is always constant, right? There's things ever changing, you have to keep up with it. But even with what we've seen over the last couple of years, that pace of change has really accelerated. It's just one thing after another, things happening in parallel, concurrently. And the conversations that I'm having with, customers, stakeholders, analysts is when we're looking at the macro environment for supply chains, we know that we have to adjust to change. But if we're going to keep pace with the change, our supply chains need to be more agile. So it's one thing that you could have resilience built into your supply chain, redundancies, planning for things that could potentially disrupt your supply chain, but being resilient isn't enough. You need to get into that modality where you're actually being agile and shifting with the winds as they're changing within your supply chain. So having the ability to flex up or flex down according to what's happening either at the macro or micro level is really where we're seeing some of the winners and some of the laggards.
It's interesting, right? So, we mentioned keeping pace, right? Resilience not being enough and agility. And I think these are terms, right? If we were to listen to someone else, on this podcast or talking about it, we'd say, all right, what does that mean, right? Like get into the details there. And maybe if you don't mind, right, talk
Yeah,
about maybe blend that with what you see out there today, right?
sure.
Systems trying to be modern, people stuck in the legacy, obviously, we can hit the buzzword right now and then we'll talk about it, right? But what AI, ranging from, generative to agentic to, everything in between, right? What that means with the large macro environment, right? We're dealing with inflation, we're dealing with, volatility with, oil and fuel prices, right? We're seeing differences in consumer trends. We're not seeing the demand pick up at the pace that we're looking for. What does that mean with, you mentioned agility? Like, how do we actually tie those two things together?
Yeah, I always like to ground some of these topics with examples so that there's more familiarity with what we're talking about. And I'll just give a transportation example to help kind of set the stage. And part of what we saw a few years ago was this resiliency conversation. I need to be resilient with the things that are happening so that I can either proactively or reactively adjust to what's going on. And part of that resiliency, let's give an example of maybe I added more carriers to my routing guides and added a different carrier mix between truckload and intermodal. So my routing guide is now more resilient because I have more carrier partners that I can rely on to move my freight and where it needs to go. So if my primary couldn't handle it, I could give it to my secondary or backup, whatever the case may be. That told me that I'm being more resilient on execution because I have more players to work with. But now what we're starting to see is people need to be more agile, and resilience is still important, but being more agile in how they handle those. So For example, having more carriers on your routing guide might not prove to be the agile factor that you need. So, for example, if we had the Baltimore Bridge collapse as a shipping container ran into it, is I need to show agility, right? That lane is now closed. So it doesn't matter if I had 10 carriers on that routing guide, I can't use that routing guide anymore. I actually need to source it with either different modes or different carriers. So having the ability to pivot and change and flex with those changing winds is now what we're starting to see as being more agile. So in the fact that I couldn't use that route or that rate or that routing guide anymore, I now needed to use a completely different set of carriers to be able to execute that freight. If I was sourcing things from a certain location, or my customer delivery pattern was around that network, I needed to be agile to flex to that. So those are the types of things that I'm talking about in an example where resilience is not enough. You also need to have agility to go along with it.
So it's almost like maybe an analogy would be, it's good to have a bunch of weapons in your arsenal, but how do you switch to the right one, right, at the right time?
Exactly. And some of these more modern tools in the war chest is, you can lean on tools that have more automation, things that have more artificial intelligence. Maybe the backbone is API, and those things allow you to pivot more quickly than if you were using, let's say, an older architecture, a system that was more monolithic. It doesn't allow you to pivot at the pace in which you need to pivot at, and having more of a modern system allows you to make those changes more effectively.
Yep. Yep. That makes a ton of sense, right? So let's jump into that, right? So let's talk about systems. And let's talk about, what we expect them to do, what we'd like them to do, what they still maybe don't do. And I think depending on who you ask and maybe even what mood they're in at the moment, right? AI is either coming to destroy us or coming to save us, or one of the, somewhere in between is my bet. But I maybe talk about that a little bit, right? We know organizations are placing their bets on AI. Many are
Mhm.
struggling to see the ROI of those or aren't sure exactly how to get there. But maybe let's just start with, like, what are you seeing? Like, and it doesn't have to be AI, right? We're picking on it because it's the 800-pound gorilla. But what kind
Mhm.
of bets are organizations making these days where they're saying, like, hey, I understand resiliency, I understand agility, I understand, what's needed within my business and how, our 5-year plan, has to align to this. But let's go down to, the trenches, right? Like, what are you seeing with,
Mhm.
your customers, and what are they looking at today?
Yeah, and I know this is all the hype and we're still in the early stages of it, but I do think it will ultimately be a step change for how our industry, at least in supply chain, manages, plans, and executes within their respective networks. Now, again, we're still in the early stages of this, and I would say this really comes down to a couple factors, and maybe I'll kind of riff here on what those factors are. The first one of which is really around trust, right? Is they need to have some level of trust that this tool is going to give me the desired output that I'm looking for. So as we are building that trust and working with a number of different stakeholders, the natural evolution of that is the crawl, walk, run approach to this technology. Is maybe first I want the artificial intelligence or these agents or these digital workers to just give me insights into what's happening, right? That's pretty low risk. It can go and find data points, key areas of exceptions, things that require your attention. It's pretty low risk for the tool to give you that intelligence. So that's where we see people going in first, is just give me insights. Tell me what's going on so I can pay attention. The next evolution of that is, okay, now that you provide me the insights of what's actually happening, provide a recommendation on what I should do next. Take the guesswork out of what I should be doing with the information that you're providing me. And now we can start using the intelligence of the artificial intelligence to start providing recommendations based on situations that are happening within the supply chain. So if a carrier didn't pick up, maybe the tool can recommend repowering it with another carrier, or maybe it recommends picking up tomorrow because it's a low priority shipment, wherever the case may be. And using that is now starting to get into the crawl, walk, run approach of, hey, you provided me the insight, you provided me the recommendation, now go and perform that action. And that's kind of that last portion of that evolution is, if I have enough trust that you're giving me the right information, you're providing me the right recommendations, why don't you just go and do that for me? And I don't have to guide you in that experience. So now I can start taking the mundane, the repeatable actions away from the users so that they're more focused on the strategic nature of their supply chain rather than clicking a bunch of buttons within their system. So I would say that's kind of the first iteration of that conversation. I have one more, but I'll let you react to that first.
No, I think it's great, right? I mean, you started with trust, right? And I think that's really important. We've all seen these things hallucinate as we use them, right? And I think it takes a really solid architecture with, you know, a great back-end knowledge layer to make these tools do what, you know, they were intended to do. And as you go from, hey, tell me what's happening, to recommend an action, to actually take that action, you know, maybe you want to hit your second point, but a follow-up question I have there is getting the humans in the loop to eventually agree to those things, to trust it, and to let go, right? Like maybe either hit your second point or let me know what your thoughts are on, you know, humans in the middle.
Human in the loop is the important step to the trust, right? Is once I see that you're providing me the right data, you're providing me the right recommendations, I don't want to have to keep telling you, okay, go do what you said you were going to do, right? Is there's a level of trust where ultimately the human in the loop won't need to happen as part of the decision making. The human in the loop will happen after the fact, after these things have already happened, where they can just have a summary of, here, here's all the things that I did and here's why I did it type of thing. And if I need to make adjustments, I can do that from there. But I would say my second point in making these more effective is the cleanliness and quality of data that these agents are referring to, right? Because if you have bad data or bad inputs, the agents are just going to either provide you bad recommendations or automate a bad process. So it actually makes the situation worse if you have bad data. So a lot of the conversations I'm happening now is they can see the power of you know, these recommendations and the process automation and all these types of things. And what we're seeing is, well, hey, this didn't give me the recommendation I was expecting. Well, when you dive down into it, the input was bad. You had bad location data, you had bad master data, you had bad item master, you know, whatever the case may be. It pointed back to the source, which was, hey, you were working with outdated information that was not real time, whatever the case may be, which I can now logically follow. This is why you gave me the recommendation you did, is because I gave you a bad source of data. So now we're starting to see more importance on the cleanliness of data, the availability of data, the accuracy of the data, because ultimately the agents and the artificial intelligence is working on that data set. So you want it to be as pristine as it can.
Yeah, I mean, the adage garbage in, garbage out is magnified exponentially by AI. And you know, going back to your first point, right? You're essentially saying you're managing your agents as employees, right? It's like, what did the agents do? A log of why they did it, reviewing it, right? And to your point then is, hey, maybe it did something because the data isn't great. You know, I've always seen myself supply chain data as kind of this bottom of the totem pole, right? The receiver of an amalgamation of bad data from various other departments, starting with sales all the way through to, you know, orders and, to your point, master data and incorrect items. And then all of a sudden you get to you know, a shipping order and like half of it is incorrect or represented in tribal knowledge, right? And so now you're trying to, you know, tell AI how to execute on something where half of the data is wrong and half of the knowledge isn't even represented in the business object itself. So I think, we certainly talked about, the evolution of, from insights to execution and good data, but, let's assume some of these are managed, right? People are making some, big strategic bets, right? And
Mhm.
they're gonna make bets on what they believe either needs to work better or what even works well. So let's go into that, right?
Yeah.
Like, what are you seeing happen there? Um, and where do you see it changing in the I guess let's go short term and long term, right?
Sure. So, at the end of the day, when you're making bets on technology or whatever the case may be, it always needs to tie back to really two core principles, which is cost and service, right? Like everything we do, we should do it cheaper, we should do it faster, and we should please the customer at the end of the day. Because if we're not doing those two things, then we're doing it wrong. So if I want to go back to those core principles, is how can I apply this technology or any other number of technologies to and pull one of those two levers, or ideally two of those at the same time. And what we're seeing with the early successes with some of the tooling, at least on the agentic front, is process automation. So where users would have to go in and push certain buttons, navigate to certain screens, apply filters to get the information that they're looking for, is these things that people would just do over and over and over again that took time and were not value add. So how can we take some of those more mundane processes, train these agents on what they should be doing and what they should be looking for, and just provide a summary back to the user on what they should be doing or paying attention to? And a good example of this is, again, going back to examples to ground it in reality, is appointment scheduling, right? Is if I need to schedule an appointment for pickup or schedule an appointment for delivery, even in the old world, you'd have to pick up the phone, call the receiver. Do you have this time available? Maybe you're emailing back and forth. Maybe you even have a system that shows like dock availability and those types of things. A user is still manually doing things, right? They're either manually calling, they're manually emailing, or they're manually picking a time slot from a system. Is like you can have an agent do all of that for you, basically, and provide you a summary of things that have been scheduled. And if it doesn't meet your ETA or availability, you can always adjust from there. But the vast majority of times is when it needs to deliver and can you accommodate that time, yes or no. So if you take some of that into consideration, is if I know that this, let's say, outbound delivery to a customer needs to happen, tomorrow, why can't I go and schedule a delivery appointment for that time? So I can take into factors transit time, ETAs, all this other information. The agent knows about all of this information. It can schedule the appointment accordingly. And then it can say, hey, I scheduled a delivery appointment for 2 o'clock tomorrow. Good to go. And then you're on your way. So all of those manual actions that I just explained, they start going by the wayside, right? Is because I have the tooling now to help process automation. But it's not just if then statements, right? Is if this customer deliver at this time, there's more intelligence that happens behind the scenes, to which these agents can now become more powerful, right? Is maybe I can punch out to an external service and say, hey, there's weather or traffic and delays on this particular route. It's going to impact my ability to deliver at this time. So that's where you start getting these full-fledged solutions. So that's where we're seeing early successes in the near term. Now, since we're making a big bet on some of these, and not, I say we as a collective supply chain experts, the long-term benefit, I think, extends well beyond process automation. I think it actually goes much further than that. And some of my predictions include um, having users look at screens and having summaries of things that are about to happen or are going to happen or already happened, and having a summary of how an agent really took that information, resolved the conflict, and pointed back to the playbook in which the rules applied. So now I'm kind of managing by exception rather than actually going through and performing a bunch of manual tasks.
It's interesting, and you alluded to something we think about a lot at Redwood, which is the evolution from two things, right? The evolution from RPA to agentic, right? So you mentioned like if then, right? So traditional robotic process automation or RPA is like, if I see this event do this exact specific task, maybe a little bit of flexibility in it, right? Versus agentic, which is I generally don't know the inputs I'm going to get, but I have a goal or an objective and I'm going to try and get it done, right? And then just that level of flexibility. And it's interesting because our industry, I would argue, is although it seems uh, to outsiders somewhat archaic, I'd say it's one of the highest automated industries out there, right? Like we've optimized routing guides and rating and bulk optimization and planning and network analysis and all these things. And it's the Pareto principle, right? Where 20% of the exceptions take up 80% of our time, right? And so, like, what you're getting at with agentic over RPA is, hey, there's a better toolkit out there, right, to identify these exceptions that generally go to teams of people. And how do we then, find additional value? Because this is something that we can measure. We know the pain point it's creating, and there's a better way to get it done. But where you then went to, I think, with your prediction that was really interesting is like, okay, let's assume we solve that problem, right? What is the future of this, right? What does this look like, right? What does it mean when, the exceptions and the appointments and the, trailer being hijacked on the middle of a important load, right? Like that those can get mostly handled by agentic. Then what, right? And you mentioned, looking at a screen and watching what the agent is thinking. And it takes me back to thinking about like, what is the value of each organization that provides supply chain and logistic services, right? It's the judgment of their people over time, right? Triggering these things to automate, even with an agentic style, what it knows can be automated, but then continuing to look for improvements within the business, right? So maybe take us a little bit further down that, right? Like when you think of a modern supply chain operations working really, really well, and maybe, weave in a little bit, right? Let's talk about, the agentic and exceptions, and then, a bit more about what your future vision looks like.
Yeah, and I think it all boils down to connectivity, right? Is we have so much data at our fingertips, both data that's internal to our organizations, but we also have data that's external to our organizations. And it's this data that's constantly being shared between parties, whether that be a shipper or a carrier, uh, a forwarder, whatever the case may be. All that data is being exchanged, right? And the ability to exchange that data at real time or near real time helps the supply chain be more effective, right? Both upstream and downstream. So the modern supply chain and those folks that can break the silos, break the roadblocks, and exchange data more effectively across their stakeholders, both upstream and downstream, will be the winners because time is money. I know it's a cliche, but it really is true in supply chain world is if there's delay in getting me the information that I need when I need it, that comes at a real cost, either a real cost for transportation, a real cost for warehouse, a real cost for planning, whatever the case may be. So if you can more effectively share that information with the stakeholders up and down the supply chain, those are the ones that will see the most benefit. Because again, a lot of the tooling that we've talked about to this point is predicated on data, whether it's data you're getting from your customers, whether it's data you're getting from your suppliers, whether it's data you're getting from your carriers or your forwarders, whatever the case may be, everyone's always exchanging data. So the way to do that, and the ones that do it most effectively, those would be the ones that are going to be the most successful.
Yeah, I mean, you hit a soft spot for me, which is, data and connectivity. I mean, it's our whole thesis, right? Which is a interconnected network of partners and systems is it's the game changer, right? It's what
Mhm.
enables, innovation and automation and connectivity and, everything upstream and downstream from there. Um, and it always goes back to like a garbage in, garbage out type of thing when people think about data and connectivity. But I think what you're describing a little bit more is real-time data that is 100% accurate. And
Mhm.
I think that's something that's maybe overlooked a little bit, which is in supply chain and logistics, right? Your data is either 100% accurate or it's wrong,
Mhm.
right? Like 99% isn't good enough because then it's somewhere in the chain, it's going to trigger something based on some piece of information being wrong, especially when everything is so highly automated, right? And we've got so much information flowing through these pipes. And I think people are looking at things more and more that way nowadays, right? So there's a shift, I think, where at least from a Manhattan and a Redwood perspective, right? We've known that good, clean data is the solution to everything. And I think with AI, people are starting to see that now because, they think, oh, if the data is bad, it's going to hallucinate. But that's not really it. It's more so, right? With good context, hallucinations drop dramatically. I think it's more of with real connectivity at high speed, you can empower these agents to do a whole lot more because you as a business can trust that these things have the right information to start making guided decisions. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And
So,
so you kind of see a pattern here, right? Is we had first talked about early in the conversation agility, right? Which is the speed in which you can adjust to change, right? And you cannot be agile unless you have a network of connections, right? You have connectivity to a number of different stakeholders up and down the supply chain. And having those connections allow you to move faster. And having good data allows you to make better decisions, which also allows you to move faster. So you kind of see a thread here in the conversation is if you want to be agile, if you want to move fast, if you want to have speed, if you want to make good decisions, you need to have the underlying data that allows you to do that. That data needs to be exchanged between different stakeholders within the supply chain and needs to be done with uh, cleanliness, it needs to be done with clarity, and it needs to be done with speed. So all of that is ultimately what allows those companies to adjust to the change and the speed of change in which we've seen within our networks most effectively. So I would say those are kind of the key levers in today's conversation.
yeah, I agree. And I think that today's conversations get hijacked a little bit by, and I don't want to call it hype because I think we're past, this being hype with AI, right? Like it's, what the end state is going to be is an evolving narrative, right? But it already is and will continue to dramatically change, the future of work. But you also mentioned, right, that good, clean data, right, is foundational, right? And there's a whole bunch of other things that are foundational. So maybe to bring this down to earth and not make it all about AI, what are you seeing where like there's a shift, right? Like whether it's strategy or an operating model or even the tech that organizations are using, right? You work with a lot of blue chip organizations, right, that really are on the forefront of looking at, how their supply chains work. How are they measuring it, right? How are they
Mhm.
seeing measurable performance? And what shifts are you seeing out there, that are more than just, hey, we got to, throw AI on it, which we can have a whole nother conversation about the
Mhm.
falseness of that narrative, but like more so on just pure strategy, right? Like what
Yeah.
what are you seeing out there?
Yeah. So I'm glad we're sidebarring here because the technology is just one aspect of the equation, right? The other portion of the equation is the human, the person who's actually, in the experience, human in the loop. So where we're starting to see more conversation is not the traditional measures of, did we lower the cost? Did we improve our service? What's OTIF and all those types of things, right? And this is quite interesting to me. They're going back to change management. They're going back to and saying, are we are we doing right by our people? Do they have the proper training? Do they have the proper expectations? Have they been involved in the testing cycles and those types of things? Because keep in mind, the tools and the technology will continue to evolve and continue to get better. What we need is to make sure that the people keep up with the changes in the technology. So we're seeing more of an emphasis on change management as well, because there's a couple different philosophies to change management. It can be from bottom up or top down. I think the most successful of change management strategies is from the top down, where you have the most buy-in from senior leadership saying, hey, here's the strategy, here's the direction we're going as an organization, and this is how we're going to do it from a people and culture perspective, right? So now people are starting to get buy-in. But one of the key factors is kind of funny is agency, right? Is, as a human, I need to have agency in the types of decisions that are being made, and the direction that we're going as a company and those types of things, because now I can have more buy-in into what we're doing instead of just being told this is what we're doing. So ironic that we're also talking about agents. We're also talking about agency as part of the person element of it, but that also plays into the human and the loop, right? Is that human that's in the loop needs to have part of not only the understanding of how this technology is going to empower them, but what should they be doing to help leverage the technology back into the organization? How is it going to improve some of those metrics that we had talked about with cost and service? Having that bigger picture of how this technology is going to play not only in their lives, but also in the holistic strategy of the company, is ultimately what's going to allow these tools to really flourish. Because again, if they're not bought into the strategy and how these tools are going to help, you're going to receive resistance along the way, but also lower adoption of the benefits that the tools can provide.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, totally right. I think at least from my lens, and I can totally, empathize with what you're saying and what you're seeing. In my 25 years of doing this, right, change management has always been the toughest, both before and after the decision has been made to institute that change. I think inherently, right, even early adopters, right, people are scared of change, their reputations, their jobs may be on the line. And, I think with the rate and pace at which the world is changing right now and technology is changing, and even what the future of work looks like is changing, that can be scary. And I had a follow-up question to what you were mentioning, which is, the future of work, right? You mentioned top down, right? Where, there's buy-in at the top and it's evangelized, to the folks, right? I think a lot of innovations start from the bottom up. Going back to AI, I think horizontal is something that's really, really interesting that I think we all haven't wrapped our really heads about which is what is the future of organizational work? The traditional org chart, is I think being impacted by AI because someone, in appointment scheduling, for example, can come up with a best practice on how to do something that could be used very well by the audit team or by others on their teams, and anyone in between. With this new reality, right, and organizations adjusting to this, are you seeing with some of your customers that like the change management, the thought leadership, the innovations are coming from places that were different than years past?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny because we always joke that, board members have, the strategy for where the company is going, but a lot of those ideas actually come from within the organization and permeate throughout and then up, where the decisions are being made. So I think you made a great point in that we shouldn't lose sight in that, it's not always top down, it's not always bottom up, but when you're having conversation with your peers and maybe even peers from other organizations, is you have like-minded people who are trying to solve similar problems, right? And there's always more than one way to skin a cat, but having the collective mind with your peers or your number of different stakeholders is you can actually ideate on best ways to solve similar problems. And the reality is if I'm working with a peer in another organization, it's likely that we're trying to solve the same problem, right? A lot of similar problems exist throughout the supply chain, whether it's on-time performance, routing guide compliance, cost to serve, OTIF, right? These are all problems we're all trying to solve. So having the collective mind come together and say, these are best practices on how we got to do that. And now you fold in the new technologies that we have available to us to solve those problems, only expedites the resolution time and how we can actually do that. So I think that's a great point in that not only do you have the technology side of it, but you also have the human element as well.
Yeah. With the caveat that best practices are just a playbook and company A's best practices will always be different than company
Yeah.
A. So having said all that, and maybe just to kind of bring this thing home a little bit, right? Like we've talked a lot about signals and what's happening out there, right? And, AI transforming or having the potential to transform everything foundationally, right? You need great systems and great connectivity. Change management is this big hairy monster, right? That everyone has to confront, right? And it's the social and political capital needed to get stuff like that done. And now, there's just I'm a supply chain leader, right? What do I do?
Yeah.
What signals, should I find through all of this noise? And in the next 90 days, if I had to do, I like to ask the one thing question, right? What's the one thing that, supply chain leaders should be thinking about right now and to act on in the next 90 days?
Yeah, and there's so much going on that sometimes people can get lost in the details and lost in the weeds. Um, and what I like to say is just take a current state evaluation. Take a look at the processes, the tools, and the people that you have in place today and say, do I have the right mix of this talent and tools to help me get where I need to go in the next 5 to 10 years? And if you're looking at an AS400 or whatever tooling you have today, and you say, you know what, that's not going to get me where I need to go. I need to make sure that I have the right mix of people, process, and technology to help get where I need to go. So that's usually what I recommend for the next 30 to 60 to 90 days is just get a pulse check on where you are within your organization. Because it's one thing to have these grand visions of where you want to go, but if you don't know what your baseline is today, you don't know what the gap is that you need to close. So take an inventory of where you're at today, set your goals for the future, and then plot the course on how you're going to get there.
It's interesting. It's like, we started this conversation at the top with, the world is changing. It's all coming at you, which I think is to your point, what, most boards are saying, like, what's your AI strategy and where are you going to be, right? And what you're really saying is, start with an assessment, right? Start with a readiness assessment of where you're at across your supply chain and logistics landscape and across your, your people and process landscape, and evaluate what's working and what's not, and then come up with that roadmap. Am I hearing that right?
That's exactly right. Is we always get enamored with the bright, shiny future of what things could be, and people often forget where are we today and how do we get there.
It's funny that a couple of tech guys are screaming to measure twice and cut once and do assessment and come up with a plan before just throwing the latest technology on there. Well, I'm all in for that, and it's what we preach both at Redwood and clearly at Manhattan. And so with that, Brian, any last comments or any parting thoughts?
No, I appreciate the conversation today, Eric. I know there's a lot coming at us at a lot of different directions, and even the stakeholders that I talk to is sometimes I can get overwhelmed, but I always like to, keep it simple and boil it down to what really matters, and the rest of it is just noise. So appreciate today's conversation, and I hope the audience got something out of it.
Likewise. Well, we appreciate your time, Brian, and we'll talk soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Above the Canopy, market-ready signals for the modern leader. Learn more about how to stay ahead at redwoodlogistics.com.